The Pacific is silent, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too knowing. The moon hangs low over Catalina Island, painting the waves in silver streaks. Out there, anchored in the still water, a yacht named Splendour drifts quietly. But on this night in late November 1981, that quiet would fracture into one of Hollywood's most haunting mysteries. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman's voice cried out, desperate, terrified, before the sea swallowed the sound forever. Hours later, Natalie Wood, the luminous star of West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause, would be found floating lifeless in the cold morning tide. She was 43 years old. It was supposed to be a simple Thanksgiving weekend getaway. Natalie, her husband Robert Wagner, her co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain Dennis Davern. For people, one luxury boat, and the glittering promise of escape from a Hollywood spotlight. But by dawn, one of them would be gone, and the other, her husband, would be forever shadowed by questions he could never seem to fully answer. For more than 4 decades, the mystery of Natalie Wood's death has refused to sink. Every investigation, every new witness, every changed statement only stirs the waters again. Officially, it was ruled an accidental drowning. Unofficially, almost no one believes it was that simple. Even now, at 95, Robert Wagner remains the last living person who knows what truly happened that night. Over the years, his story has shifted, small details changing, memories rewritten, motives questioned. And now, in his twilight years, Wagner speaks once more. But the question remains, is this a long-awaited truth or just another version of a story too painful to face? In this video, we'll revisit that night aboard the Splendour. We'll piece together the conflicting timelines, the bruises that didn't quite make sense, and the words of witnesses who claim they heard screams across the dark water. We'll explore Wagner's evolving explanations and the chilling possibility that the truth was never lost, only hidden beneath the surface, waiting to rise. Because in the story of Natalie Wood, one thing is certain. Hollywood's brightest stars cast the darkest shadows. Natalie was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in 1938 to Russian immigrant parents who had fled a world of hardship and uncertainty. From the beginning, her mother saw something extraordinary in her, a spark of magic that Hollywood might just recognize. She was barely a child when cameras first captured her face, and by the time she turned 9, she was already America's sweetheart, immortalized in Miracle on 34th Street. It was a role that defined the rest of her life. The girl who embodied innocence and belief, even as she grew up surrounded by adult ambition and the relentless machinery of fame. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Natalie became one of the defining actresses of her generation. Her performances in Rebel Without a Cause, Splendour in the Grass, and West Side Story showed both vulnerability and a fierce emotional intelligence. She wasn't just beautiful. She was magnetic, capable of projecting loneliness, strength, and heartbreak all at once. Yet behind that poise was a woman burdened by private fears and anxieties. Friends and colleagues spoke often of her sensitivity, her perfectionism, and her well-documented fear of dark water, a detail that would later seem chillingly symbolic. By the 1970s, her career had begun to slow, but she remained one of Hollywood's most beloved and enigmatic stars, glamorous, deeply private, and still haunted by the pressures of the spotlight. Robert John Wagner, Jr., born in 1930 in Detroit, Michigan, took a very different path into stardom. Handsome, charming, and effortlessly debonair, he became one of Hollywood's most reliable leading men through a string of film and television roles. His big screen credits included The Pink Panther, The Towering Inferno, and Harper, while his television work in It Takes a Thief, Switch, and a hit romantic crime series Heart cemented him as a household name. On screen, Wagner was a perfect gentleman, suave, controlled, endlessly likable. Off-screen, however, those who knew him best spoke of an inner complexity. A man both ambitious and deeply insecure, struggling to hold on to relevance as the entertainment landscape shifted around him. When Natalie and Robert first met in the early 1950s, Hollywood saw them as the ideal couple, beautiful, successful, and deeply in love. She was 19. He was nearly 27. They married in December 1957 in a ceremony that made headlines around the world. But behind the glamour, their relationship was volatile. Both were navigating fame, ego, and emotional fragility. Rumors of jealousy, professional envy, and outside flirtations followed them constantly. By 1962, the pressures had become too much, and they divorced. Natalie later described that first breakup as one of the darkest times of her life. A decade later, fate, or perhaps nostalgia, brought them back together. In 1972, Natalie and Robert remarried, promising each other a second chance at the happiness that had once slipped through their fingers. The world was captivated. Two of Hollywood's most famous lovers reunited after years apart. They settled into a life of apparent domestic bliss, raising Natalie's daughter Natasha from her previous marriage to producer Richard Gregson, and welcoming their own daughter Courtney in 1974. Publicly, they appear to have found peace. Privately, friends notice the same old tensions resurfacing: jealousy over Natalie's career, Wagner's temper, and the strain of two powerful personalities trying to coexist. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, their image as the perfect Hollywood couple had begun to show cracks. The glamorous parties, the smiles of photographers, and the elegant red carpet appearances masked a marriage under pressure. Still, to the outside world, Robert and Natalie were golden, the embodiment of enduring love in a town built on illusion. No one could have imagined that within a few short years, their names would be forever tied not to a love story, but to a tragedy that would define them both for generations. The long Thanksgiving weekend in 1981 was supposed to be an escape, a quiet, glamorous getaway from the pressures of Hollywood life. Natalie Wood, at 43, was working on the sci-fi film Brainstorm alongside actor Christopher Walken, a project that had reignited her enthusiasm for acting. Her husband, Robert Wagner, then 51, was starring in the hit television show Heart to Heart, and the couple's life appeared charmed from the outside. Yet beneath the polished surface, subtle tensions were building between career ambitions, aging fame, and private insecurities. Against this backdrop, Natalie suggested a short cruise aboard their 60-foot yacht, Splendour, to Catalina Island, a familiar retreat for the couple. Originally, it was to be a sociable weekend. Several friends were invited, but one by one, they declined. In the end, it was just the Wagners, Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. Davern had worked with the couple for years, a quiet observer of their domestic rhythms, both the warmth and the sudden storms that could erupt between them. On Friday, November 27th, they set out from Marina del Rey toward Catalina. To outsiders, it looked like a picture of relaxation, Hollywood royalty enjoying a simple island escape. But for those on board, something darker was stirring. That evening, the group dined on Catalina at a restaurant called Doug Harbor Reef, a cozy island spot known for its seafood and stiff drinks. By all accounts, there was plenty of laughter and plenty of alcohol. Witnesses later confirmed that the party consumed several bottles of wine and cocktails before heading back to the yacht. But somewhere between the final toast and the quiet sea crossing, the mood shifted. According to Wagner's own later admission, in his memoir Pieces of My Heart, an argument erupted between him and Walken. Walken, focused on his craft and discussing Natalie's film career, reportedly praised her ambition and independence, remarks that Wagner interpreted as disrespectful or even flirtatious. Voices were raised. The tension that had been simmering for 2 days finally boiled over. Captain Dennis Davern would later tell investigators and journalists that the argument exploded once they returned aboard Splendour. He described the yacht as filled with shouting, first between Natalie and Wagner, then between Wagner and Walken. According to Davern, Natalie retreated to her cabin, while Wagner continued drinking. By his account, the atmosphere turned icy, and everyone eventually withdrew to separate quarters. Around 11 p.m., from another boat anchored nearby, a woman named Marilyn Wayne claimed she heard desperate cries from the water. "Help me! Someone please help me! I'm drowning!" The voice, she said, was female, terrified, fading, and calling out repeatedly. Wayne also reported hearing a man's slurred voice reply, "Hold on, we're coming to get you." No one ever came forward to confirm the origin of those cries. In his own version of events, Robert Wagner has always maintained a calmer account. He said that after his argument with Walken, he tried to cool off and eventually went to bed. Sometime later, he noticed that Natalie was gone, and so was the yacht's small inflatable dinghy, the Valiant. Initially, he assumed she might have gone ashore or tried to secure the dinghy, which had been banging against the side of the yacht earlier in the night. When she returned, he grew worried and alerted Davern. A search of the surrounding waters yielded nothing. By the next morning, Natalie Wood's body was discovered floating face down about a mile from the yacht, dressed in a red jacket, flannel nightgown, and socks. The Valiant was found nearby, beached on the rocks. Wagner later theorized that Natalie, hearing the dinghy's noise, had gone to tie it off, slipped on the swim step, hit her head, and fallen into the water. Unable to climb back aboard, she drowned while trying to stay afloat in the dark, frigid sea. He has always denied any malicious intent. There are only two possibilities, Wagner once said. Either she slipped and fell, or something happened that no one can ever explain. Yet, as investigators would later uncover, inconsistencies in every account, from Davern's shifting testimony to Wagner's careful wording, would keep this story alive for decades. The truth, it seemed, had drifted away with the tide that night. The first sign that something was wrong came just after 11 p.m. on November 28, 1981. The air was calm off Catalina Island, the sea unusually still. Aboard the Splendour, Robert Wagner and Captain Dennis Davern realized Natalie wasn't in her cabin. Her favorite red down jacket was missing, and so was a small inflatable dinghy tied to the yacht's stern. Wagner later said he assumed she had gone to quiet the dinghy, which had been banging against the hull earlier in the night. But when the minutes turned to hours, quiet unease began to turn into panic. At around 1:30 a.m., a ship-to-shore radio call went out, reporting Natalie as missing. The Coast Guard was officially alerted around 3:30 a.m., but by then, several crucial hours had passed. Searchlights swept over the dark waters around the island, and private boats joined in as word began to spread among the small harbor community. The Splendour was found adrift, engines off, sitting in neutral. The dinghy, the Valiant, was later discovered beached in a nearby cove, its oars still inside and the ignition switch off. At approximately 5:30 a.m., search efforts intensified, with rescue boats combing the shoreline and divers preparing to enter the water. Finally, just after 8 a.m., a search helicopter spotted something floating near the rocky shore, a figure in a red jacket. It was Natalie Wood. She was found face down about a mile from the yacht, motionless in the early morning light. When her body was brought ashore, investigators documented every detail. She was dressed in a flannel nightgown, socks, and a red down-filled jacket, the kind heavy enough, when soaked, to drag even a strong swimmer beneath the surface. The autopsy revealed a number of troubling findings. There were fresh bruises on her arms and legs, a small abrasion on her left cheek, and marks that suggested she may have struggled in the water. The coroner's office also noted fingernail scratches on the side of the dinghy, as if someone had tried desperately to climb back in. Her blood alcohol content measured 0.14%, well above the legal driving limit, and traces of a motion sickness pill and painkiller were also found, substances that could have increased her disorientation and reduced her coordination. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, Los Angeles County's chief medical examiner at the time, ruled the cause of death as accidental drowning and hypothermia. His conclusion was that Natalie, slightly intoxicated and disoriented, slipped while trying to secure the dinghy and fell into the cold Pacific. But even Noguchi himself later expressed doubts. In his memoir, he questioned whether it made sense that a woman with a lifelong, very public fear of dark water would leave the yacht alone at night, in only a nightgown and socks, without waking anyone for help. She feared water too deeply, he wrote years later. I could never quite accept that she would have gone out there alone. That doubt has lingered ever since. The bruises on Natalie's body, though consistent with accidental injury, were never fully explained. Some appear to be defensive. Others could have come from impact against the yacht. The heavy parka she wore would have weighed 30 to 40 pounds once soaked, making it nearly impossible to swim. And then there was the troubling timeline. Why so many hours passed between her disappearance and the Coast Guard alert? Critics later asked why Wagner didn't immediately search the deck with spotlights or call for help sooner. According to Captain Davern, Wagner seemed hesitant to involve authorities, insisting they should look for her quietly. Wagner, for his part, always denied this, insisting he believed she had taken the dinghy ashore and would soon return. There were also the mysterious details surrounding the Valiant. The dinghy's position on the rocks suggested it hadn't been running under power. Its motor was off, key still in the ignition, and no signs of external collision. If Natalie had tried to escape tension on the yacht, why would she steer toward rough shoreline instead of the safety of the harbor? And if she intended only to secure it, why were the ropes still attached to the stern cleat, not floating freely? As the investigation unfolded, these unanswered questions only multiplied. The official record said accident. The physical evidence whispered struggle. And those who loved Natalie most, including her sister, Lana Wood, began to wonder if the truth had been left behind somewhere in that long, dark night between the last sound of laughter and the first call for help. When the sun rose over Los Angeles on December 2nd, 1981, Hollywood was already in mourning. Natalie Wood, beloved actress, mother, icon, was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park, surrounded by the industry's elite. Robert Wagner stood graveside with their daughters, Natasha and Courtney, his face a mask of quiet devastation. The world saw a grieving husband, and perhaps he was. But whispers began before the flowers had even wilted. Within days, speculation rippled through tabloids and newsrooms alike. How could a woman with such a deep fear of water end up drowned in the sea she so avoided? Still, by December 11th, just 2 weeks after her death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department closed case. The official ruling, accidental drowning, seemed neat, final, and acceptable to most. But for those who knew her best, it was anything but. For nearly 30 years, the story stayed buried alongside Natalie. Then, in November 2011, everything changed. Captain Dennis Davern, the Splendor's longtime skipper, came forward with a startling confession. Speaking publicly for the first time, he admitted he had lied during the original investigation. Out of fear, loyalty, and pressure. His conscience, he said, had tormented him for decades. Now, he was ready to tell the truth. Davern's revised account painted a far darker picture than the one police had accepted in 1981. He alleged an explosive argument had broken out between Wagner and Natalie that night, that Wagner had been enraged, and that he'd heard the sounds of struggle before chilling silence fell over the yacht. He claimed that Wagner had discouraged him from immediately calling for help and insisted they not turn on the floodlights or search too loudly. "We didn't do everything we could to find her," Davern admitted. "I blame myself for not fighting harder." His words ignited headlines worldwide. Within days, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced they were reopening the case. For the first time in decades, investigators were treating Natalie Wood's death as potentially suspicious. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed autopsy photos, and re-examined the yacht's logs. Davern's credibility was debated. Some saw him as seeking attention, others as unburdening a long-held secret. But his claims aligned with what many had always suspected, that there was more to that night than an accident. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office took the extraordinary step of officially amending Natalie Wood's death certificate. The cause was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The revision acknowledged what had become increasingly clear. No one could definitively explain how she ended up in the water, nor could the bruises on her body be fully reconciled with a simple fall. It was a quiet but profound shift, a bureaucratic line on a form, but one that reopened an emotional wound for everyone involved. The following year, in 2013, a supplemental report added further context. The coroner now noted that several injuries on Natalie's body appeared to have occurred before she entered the water. Blunt force bruises inconsistent with the random scrapes of an accidental fall. The finding deepened suspicion and turned public opinion further against Wagner. Then came the bombshell in 2018. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department officially reclassified Natalie's case as suspicious, and Robert Wagner was named a person of interest. In interviews, Detective Raul Hernandez made a careful but damning statement. "We have not been able to prove this was a homicide, but we have also been unable to prove it was purely accidental." Investigators described Wagner's multiple retellings of that night as inconsistent, especially in comparison with earlier statements. Each time he spoke publicly, New details seemed to appear or shift, a pattern that only fueled doubt. Witnesses also began to emerge with new claims. A former deckhand from a nearby fishing boat recalled hearing a woman's screams at night, but never reporting them because the case was already closed. Another couple, anchored within earshot of the Splendour, described hearing shouting and a woman's cries followed by silence. While none of these accounts definitively proved foul play, together they painted a haunting portrait of chaos and fear in the final hours before Natalie's death. By May 2022, more than 40 years after the tragedy, a brief report circulated saying Robert Wagner had effectively been cleared by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. They had found no new evidence sufficient for charges. For Wagner, then in his 90s, it might have felt like the final word, a long-delayed vindication. But for Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, and for many others who had followed the case for decades, it was another unsatisfying chapter in a story that refused to find peace. The investigation might have ended once more, but the questions and the doubts continued to echo like waves breaking against Catalina's dark, rocky shore. When Robert Wagner released Pieces of My Heart in 2008, he knew what the world wanted, a confession, or at least a crack in the decades-old mystery surrounding Natalie Wood's death. What they got instead was something more measured, a controlled vulnerability. Wagner did, for the first time, acknowledge that there had been tension that night aboard the Splendour. He admitted he had argued not only with Natalie, but also with Christopher Walken, who was then at the height of his rising fame and working with Natalie on Brainstorm. Wagner described it as a jealous husband's quarrel, a flash of insecurity in the glare of Hollywood's spotlight. But he stopped short of admitting any wrongdoing. Nobody knows exactly what happened, he wrote, a line that has since become his refrain. In interviews following the book's release, Wagner offered a theory that Natalie, upset after the argument, might have gone to untie the dinghy herself, possibly to secure it or to cool off. She may have slipped, he suggested, and fallen into the dark water. He maintained that it was an accident, tragic, senseless, but an accident all the same. If I'd known, he once said, I would have done anything to save her. He was careful, though, to leave space between fact and speculation, never stating with certainty, always circling back to that elusive line, nobody knows. Throughout the years, his daughters, Natasha Gregson Wagner and Courtney Wagner, have stood by him. Both have publicly defended their father, rejecting insinuations of violence or guilt. In interviews and documentaries, Natasha often speaks with quiet intensity, insisting that the man she knows could never have harmed her mother. Their loyalty has softened his public image, painting Wagner less as a suspect and more as an aging widower haunted by loss and rumor. Yet, as he entered his 90s, whispers of a final revelation began to swirl once again. Tabloid headlines proclaimed, Robert Wagner finally tells all. But when one looks closer, these so-called revelations rarely contain anything new. Most are recycled from his memoirs or drawn from archival interviews repackaged as fresh admissions. As of 2025, no verified new confession or discovery has surfaced. No deathbed statement. No long-lost recording. No hidden letter. Wagner, now 95, remains alive but largely withdrawn from public life. The idea of a final truth lingers as both a media fantasy and a haunting possibility. If such a revelation were ever come, it would likely take one of several forms. Wagner could clarify or retract earlier statements, perhaps acknowledging that his timeline was off, or that he downplayed the extent of the argument. He might name a witness he once omitted, or offer a personal apology framed in ambiguity rather than guilt. Or, in the most dramatic scenario, he could concede knowledge he long denied, something small but significant enough to reframe public understanding. Yet even then, without corroborating evidence, physical proof, forensic support, or credible new testimony, the revelation would remain emotional, not legal. In truth, the mystery of Natalie Wood's death has always depended less on hidden documents and more on human memory, fractured, fading, and fallible. If Wagner's true revelation comes, it may not be an admission of guilt, but final reflection, the words of a man who has lived too long with silence, finally acknowledging that the truth was never as simple as anyone wanted it to be. After more than 4 decades, Natalie Wood's death continues to live in a fog of conflicting testimonies, fragmentary evidence, and evolving interpretations. Every retelling circles back to the same question, not how she died, but why she ended up in the water at all. Below are the most debated theories that attempt to explain that fateful night on the Splendour. In the simplest and most official narrative, Natalie's death was an unfortunate accident. According to Wagner's long-held version, she was disoriented, possibly drunk, with a BAC of 0.14%, and went secure or retied the dinghy after hearing it knock against the yacht's hull. Wearing only a flannel nightgown, socks, and a heavy parka, she may have slipped, struck her head, and fallen into the cold Pacific waters. The parka's weight could have pulled her under. Once soaked, it might have weighed as much as 30 to 40 pounds. The bruises, in this theory, were consistent with her struggle to climb back aboard. Scratch marks on the dinghy support that interpretation. Still, skeptics find this version incomplete. Why would Natalie, who was famously terrified of water, venture out alone into the darkness? Why the long delay before an alarm was raised? This theory blends accident with conflict. By many accounts, an argument erupted that night, sparked by alcohol, jealousy, or tension between Wagner, Natalie, and Walken. Some suggest the confrontation became physical, a shove, a sudden movement, and Natalie fell overboard. The bruises on her arms and legs that support this, implying some level of struggle before she entered the water. In this scenario, Wagner's later confusion and inconsistent timeline might stem not from guilt of murder, but from panic, shock, or fear of scandal. Supporters of this view describe it as an accident born of emotion, not premeditation, a tragic domestic dispute that spiraled into irreversible loss. The darkest interpretation frames Natalie's death as deliberate. Proponents point to her bruises, the autopsy's ambiguous findings, and testimony from witnesses who later claimed to have heard a woman screaming, followed by a man's voice that night. Wagner's status as a person of interest and his admitted argument with Natalie lend the theory weight in some circles. But no forensic evidence or verified confession has ever confirmed this version. The 2018 reclassification of the case as suspicious only deepened public speculation. If Wagner did act violently, intentionally or in rage, it would explain the delay in reporting her missing and the inconsistencies in his accounts. Yet without proof, the theory remains firmly in the realm of possibility, not fact. A subtler variation suggests that Natalie, distressed and seeking distance from the argument, tried to leave the Splendour via the dinghy, perhaps with the intention of sleeping ashore. She might have been assisted, persuaded, or pushed in a moment of heated confusion. If so, her escape attempt could have been half voluntary, a decision made under duress, impaired by alcohol and emotion. Once in the dinghy or near it, she may have lost balance, leading to her fall. This theory bridges a gap between the accident and foul play camps, presenting her death as an impulsive act that turned catastrophic. Even if Natalie's fall was accidental, many argue that what followed was anything but. Critics focus on the time lapse between her disappearance and the Coast Guard alert, nearly 4 hours, as a serious mishandling. Why didn't Wagner or the crew use spotlights immediately? Why weren't nearby vessels notified sooner? Was the motive to avoid scandal, to protect reputations, or to hope she'd turn up unharmed? This theory doesn't accuse Wagner of causing her death, but of compounding it, through hesitation, fear, or control over the narrative that followed. Whether Natalie Wood's death was a tragic misstep, an unintentional escalation, or something darker, the fact remains. Her story sits at the crossroads of Hollywood glamour and human frailty, a mystery where emotion, image, and truth have blurred beyond clear resolution.